So the work I'm going to talk about today is being led by one of my PhD students, Alison Catalano, who's just in the final writing up stages now. She should be finished next couple of months. So I wanted to talk about learning from failure. So I came straight out of uni back in 1995, and I started to work for the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service in a unit that did bioregional planning. And we were developing new techniques for the department to allocate resources using spatial analysis for deciding where on reserve, so setting up formally protected areas were going to be, private land conservation, and trying to integrate that with cultural heritage management, so Aboriginal sites of special interest. I worked on 2 projects, and they were absolute failures. So we worked for 4 years trying to set up, we did great science. We developed some of the early software, C-Plan, working with that. Some of the very first spatial analysis looking at allocating resources for conservation in Australia. Worked with people like Bob Pressey and Simon Ferrier to improve that software. We had a mandate from our agency. One of the 4 core themes that National Parks and Wildlife was supposed to implement was bioregional planning. They didn't allocate any money to it, so we got money from the federal government, and after 4 years, nobody was using our work. I got pretty grumpy about this, and it was a bee in my bonnet. I need to figure it out, so I quit my job and I went and did a PhD in South Africa. So I just give you that story because I'm going to criticise people today who don't talk about their failures, and I'm just laying my first professional one, and there have been subsequently others, at your feet in an act of humility, which is something that we should all be adopting if we want to learn. So what's the goal for conservation? Protect species, fauna.
Least cost.
Try and save money, do it cost efficiently. If you've got money to start off with. Yeah. Sorry?
Fulfill the objective, whatever the objective is.
Fulfill an objective for a conservation project? Well, I disagree with all of you. So I think it's learning is our primary objective. So biodiversity is what we measure to know if we're effective and if we're learning effectively. And so why do we need to do that? And I add just in there too, improving human well-being as we go along. That's a bit of a contentious thing. But why should we be focused on learning? And I'm not the first person to say this. Nick Salaski wrote a good paper in 2002 about this. The first is we're a really young discipline and we do social science really, really badly. There's been a couple of reviews that have come out recently that have talked about the problems associated with ecologists doing social research and the standard of reporting in peer-reviewed literature, most of which wouldn't get published in social science journals. So we're not doing ourselves any favours there. The second that you'll be aware of, we work within these wicked contexts. We work on these wicked problems where sometimes our own interventions make the problems worse when we intervene. And there's some emerging literature on that parallels other fields. And that's primarily because the systems we work in are highly complex, so they have lots of parts that are connected in all sorts of different ways. They change all the time, and those parts and those interactions are really variable. They're highly heterogeneous. So uncertainty is high in the systems we work on. There's also multiple realities in a system. So this idea that there's one factual truth, I would argue, is a complete myth. That's going to be portrayed by some of the results I talk about later. But for example, you can have a project manager and a project officer, and they'll debate as to whether or not their project was effective or not, and the conditions under which it was effective or not. I would argue that there are multiple realities. 2 people have different versions of what the truth is. And then finally, we know that failure is the norm. I'm going to talk about some figures now, further into the talk. But I would argue that failure happens far more often than success does with our conservation initiatives. And simply because it's happening so often, we need to be learning from it. So I'm not the first person to suggest we should be learning from failure. We should be recognising our failures. There's a whole bunch of people that have been doing this for multiple decades now. There are South Africans in there, there's Americans, there's some Australians. Richard Hobbs, hiding up the back there, was the first that I'm aware of to actually get a journal to have a section that talked about failure, that looked to document failures. And that was a bit of a landmark step. So there have been people that have been calling for documenting failures and learning from failures for a long time now, but there's been very little action that's taken place in that regard. So Alice and I started wanting to look at this. She's the last one in a succession of PhDs and master's students I've had working on this. So the first thing we wanted to do was review other sectors, because other sectors have been grappling with failure for much, much longer than they have in conservation. So I'm going to talk about commercial aviation. The military's been doing it for hundreds of years. The business sector, because these are sectors where, in worst case scenario, if you stuff up, people die, and lots of people can die. In conservation, you could argue that the species extinction is a big deal, and I would agree with that, but usually people aren't going to die from a conservation activity. We also started to do targeted interviews using qualitative approaches with specific key identified individuals. We used focus groups, primarily because individuals and talking with them one-on-one is good for elucidating an individual's own psychology, what their values and attitudes and behaviours are, but it doesn't tell you much about them in a team context. So, and because most of us work in teams most of the time, unless we understand a team dynamic, we're not going to be able to address learning from failure. So we did focus groups as well. And then we did a global survey, psychometric-like survey of conservation practitioners across the planet. And so some of this I'm going to talk about today. So when we look at the literature, and we dive into the conservation journal specifically, what do we find? Well, the first is, comparatively, there's a lot on biological failures. So we had 2 types of reseeding for an endangered plant species, and we had a control. We trialled those, and we found that type B, or technique B, was the most effective. Nest boxes are another one. We trialled 2 different size nest boxes for a particular threatened bird species. We found the smaller one worked better than the big one. So that sort of work, there's quite a lot done. And Bill Sutherland's book, I don't know if you've seen it, it's really worth a look. One of the things it highlights, though, is how divergent science is in its findings. So you'll find a species that had 3 similar studies done it, and 2 will say it works and 1 will say it doesn't work. So it comes back to this importance of replication in science. There's very, very little written about people and about the teams that we work in and about organisations in particular. And this contrasts heavily with other sectors. So if you look at healthcare, or the military, for example, a lot is written. So commercial aviation, there are databases that are developed that have trillions of records in it to document failures. The US naval aviators have a newsletter where people write up their own stories of failure. I'm going to talk a bit more about that. So the first thing that gets revealed is it's a mess out there. So people are having a really hard time. They're often failing for reasons that they don't understand or they can't identify. The causes are usually multiple. And it's a classic case, in most cases of reported failure in the peer-reviewed literature, of wicked problems. In the first instance, there's very few studies that have been documented. You probably knew that already. If you flip through any of the major conservation journals, you won't often find a paper that actually lays out why something went wrong. Success is reported 4 times more often than failure is. So people seem happy to say, yep, I translocated this species and it seems to work. One of the challenges, though, with that is normally reports of success are done in very short time frames after translocation, for example, has been done. You won't find a study that looks at 30 years after the species has been translocated, which is obviously problematic, particularly for long-lived species. And that makes sense because people are happy to talk about what works, because talking about failure makes people vulnerable. Despite these calls, which have come consistently throughout the literature over time for people to document failures, there hasn't been a significant increase, a statistically significant increase in the numbers of reports. So the recognition in the peer-reviewed literature of the importance of documenting failures and learning from it hasn't been manifest. Failure is almost never used in the title of an article, but it's used a lot in the text of an article. So you very, very rarely see, the failure of a translocation program for bilbies in Western Australia. They'll talk about lessons learnt from, and those sorts of terminologies. One of the things that we found that people use over 50 different terms to describe failure without using the word fail. Things didn't go quite as planned, those sorts of terms. And most of the time people talk about other people's failures. So typically you get an academic who'll go into, say, a government department and review their program and talk about how terrible it was and why it didn't function. And I say this as a former academic. I've only been back in government for 5 months now. And so people aren't talking about what went wrong with what they did and how the things that they did didn't work, but they'll go and review other people's work, which is kind of chickening out in a way. There are almost no studies where there's been a failure where a new alternative technique has been tested. So if you look in other sectors, so for example in medicine, we did another study there where we reviewed experiences that were reported by doctors, surgeons specifically. When they write up a failure, typically what they do, and I kid you not, there was one of them where a person cut off the wrong leg in an amputation. Typically what they then do is they debrief, they think about it, they change the way they do that operation. They do that operation a couple of times again, and then they report it. In conservation, it tends to be more an emotional exercise where something goes wrong and people say, this didn't work, and then they lay out what the case study was. The difference there is they haven't done any formal, systematic, structured learning in terms of unpacking that. They haven't tested a new approach. Few identified the importance of learning from failure. So we suspect that this is implicit. People think it's important to write it up, and sometimes it might just simply be cathartic, getting that emotional stress off your chest. But the actual act of learning wasn't documented. And one of the challenges in terms of a scientific approach to learning from failure, which other sectors have implemented, is that data tends to be personal experience. So whilst I don't want to invalidate that, I would suggest that a more scientific approach, so expert knowledge is essential, particularly in these complex contexts, but often, typically, it's somebody relating in a narrative form what their experience was. So the potential to learn vicariously through the literature is not being realised. We don't have enough studies. The studies that are done aren't being done in a structured sort of way, and they're not being reported in the literature so that other people can access them. So when we look at causes of failure, this is why I called it a mess before. So there are many, many different types. What we find is that people are largely the problem, and you probably thought that already. In some ways, the review didn't tell us much that was new. But essentially, it's relationships between people, competing interests, people falling out, different values, different ideas of priorities, different assessments of when a failure's happened or not. And often failures from learning people will talk about, particularly when they're talking about other people's failure to learn. Psychological reactions was a really big one as well. So people are experiencing fear or this culture of blame where responsibility for a failure has been allocated. Risk aversion has often been identified as well, which in the business literature we'd call entrepreneurial orientation, and trust is a big one. Interestingly, you often hear, we talked about money just a second ago, conservation professionals talk all the time about not having enough money, but money falls right down in the lower end of the reasons for why projects might have failed, which we thought was interesting. So the message here is that there's many reasons for failure. They often interact. People will dispute what actually may have been a primary cause, and sometimes the causes are obvious and sometimes they're not. So I gave a bit of a hammering to people that don't report in the literature. So if you were going to write up a failure, and I would encourage you to do this, what would a paper look like that you might submit to a journal? The first thing you do is you report your own failure. Don't go and evaluate somebody else's ahead of doing one yourself. The primary reason for that is you know that project better than anybody else. If you go and review somebody's project, most of the techniques that we used were interviews with people that were on the project. How do you know those people are telling you the truth when it's a really sensitive topic and their boss might be sitting over the way, or they've got a funding grant they want to put in soon and they know that a failure is not going to do them any favours in terms of securing that grant. So reporting your own failure is a good start. Secondly, we need donors and editors to want to report failure. So at the moment, most donors, and this is anecdotal information, having done an informal discussion with a bunch of donors in the US and the UK, they require what did you learn, but there's no systematic structured unpacking of how they arrived at that. They don't generate data in the same way, for example, as the commercial aviation sector does, where they have databases with trillions of flights, literally, in them, which they can then mine, looking for patterns for why things fail. Developing a common standard. So there has been discussion, for example, with Mark Schwartz from Conservation Science and Practice about having a template in a new section so that then we would have a database where we've actually got fields that we can then analyse at some point in the future when we've got enough records. Important thing there too is that structured approach probably needs to be tempered with or complemented with a narrative. So people tend to want to write in a narrative because it's a way for getting out the emotion, the stress, the sense of loss that they might be experiencing. And it also tells the story in a way that's more systemic rather than reductionist in terms of painting a picture of the experience rather than breaking it down into these individual elements that we might want to map. We have to be using systematic approaches, and we need to be going, when you look at these other sectors, identifying, analysing, correcting and sharing failures. We need to be doing specific activities and have techniques and systems for doing each of those 4 things. And reporting on the methodology and techniques. So if you're sampling bilbies, you wouldn't think twice about saying, we laid this many traps in this sort of arrangement at this time of year. Most of the time, methodologies and techniques weren't reported into how people generated their information. Only 22% of studies actually documented how they found or sourced the information they had. And then we should be reporting after we've attempted to correct a failure. So that's good science. Something didn't work, we redesign it, we test it again in a situation which is as close as possible to the original one, and then we report what happened, rather than just saying, yep, this went wrong, and this is why we think that happened. And finally, avoid a strong culture of reporting but a poor culture of learning. So it's one thing, and this is one of the issues with the conservation literature now, what studies have been reported, that's great, but they haven't actually been situated in a system where there's going to be a cultural shift. Because at the moment, I've run half a dozen symposiums over the last 10 years on failure at various national and international conferences. You see very few talks about failure, but when you present a talk about failure, you get descended upon by people afterwards saying, I tried to save jaguars, I've been working on jaguars, this is the last one I had, from a guy in South America, I'm a conservation biologist, been doing it for 10 years, they're still disappearing, I don't know what to do. And I don't have the answer for that. But he's happy to talk about it offline, but he's not necessarily prepared to write about it in order to share that learning. So we've got to be conscious about changing culture, not just writing papers. So when we look at other sectors that I've been alluding to so far, commercial aviation, military aviation, business and medicine, which have been grappling with failure for a long time and where failures have potentially life and death consequences, what can we learn? Well, the first is that failure is absolutely everywhere. All these other sectors talk about failure all the time, and I'm not saying that everybody in those sectors is talking about failure, because they're not, but they have a much stronger history of documenting failures. So if you want to read into this more, Atal Gawande's book on complication and Henry Marsh's book, Do No Harm. Henry Marsh is a neuroscientist, I don't know if you read this book, and he talks about how he undertook an operation. There's a 15% chance the operation is going to be successful. He ends up nicking an artery in some poor person's head. They get a brain hemorrhage and they die on the table. And he talks about this, why it happened, the ethical conundrums, the technical issues around these challenges, subsequently technology being developed where if he had had it 5 years before, he may not have made that mistake. And it's a really important book, I would argue. The airline sector has, as I said, huge databases. Every flight, every commercial flight has a black box recorder. When there are only 2 companies in the world that are allowed to, or are supposed to, registered to analyse those black boxes. When they have a crash, a system kicks into place. All these legally required processes happen. And part of the reason for that is so we have a structured approach to try and figure out what went wrong. We talked to Alison's husband, who flew F-18s over Iraq and now is a commercial pilot for United. He talked about systems that they use on aircraft carriers, which I'll talk more about later. But the military, when something goes wrong, so he was involved in he had a wing fall off a plane mid-air, and he had to eject. I'll unpack that in a bit of a further into the discussion. There's this grade here, the number plate up there, too big to fail. That was Robert Kindler, who was in charge of Morgan Stanley when the global financial crisis happened, and Morgan Stanley was one of the 4 big banking organisations that basically let that happen. So that's what we're going to draw some lessons from there. The first thing is that we struggle to simply conceptualise failure. So this is some work that I did with Anne Toomey and Joss Barlow a few years ago. The common way that people report failure in the literature is this way, in that we do science and there's a direct linear relationship to society, and failure happens in this place here. What we think actually happens now is this is linear, this is systemic, okay? So we're aiming for this G spot in here, excuse the acronym, Anne came up with that one. And what we talk about now is not a gap, but a space that we need to navigate. We need to work with people in complex arrangements, partnerships, monitoring what we do, gathering data, where science is one type of knowledge, and it's not the leading one that would necessarily be performing or guiding actions. So now we're suggesting we need to be thinking this way before we can even be designing solutions. The second then is, in conservation, we typically look for one definition of failure. We want a population of 100 breeding individuals 5 years after our post-translocation. But if you look at medicine, we found at least 3 different definitions of what a failure is. So if you've got somebody, if your definition of failure in medicine is whether the patient survives or not, how is that a useful definition if a patient comes to you who already has severe cancer, has a 6-month life expectancy? You know they're going to die. You can't help them. The definition, a useful definition then is, can you reduce the person's suffering in those last 6 months? Because you're not going to stop them dying. And I'll use that analogy because it's analogous perhaps with species going extinct. The other thing, another useful insight there is in the military, talking to Peter Catalano, they do a bombing run over Iraq. Normally would take about 45 minutes. The one example that he uses, 3-story building, the idea was to raise it to the ground. They fly, they drop their bombs, they come back, they do a debrief. Satellite imagery comes through, the satellite imagery says only the top 2 floors of the building were taken out. So failure initially was defined before they left as raising the building to the ground. They look at the remote sense imagery, they see the top 2 floors go, then they reassess what failure means. Okay, the top 2 floors are gone, looks like a lot of damage, likelihood that somebody survived is low. Well, we won't call that a failure. That's a success. We're going to move on. So the point I'm making is it's not always useful to have a single definition, and having variable definitions over time might actually be a useful way to go. I want to use an example of these multiple definitions and the complexity of failure using a stewardship program that we worked on over the last 10 years in South Africa, down in the Cape Floristic region, which is similar in terms of its vegetation to this part of the world here. So we have stakeholders that enter a stewardship program, private landholders signing covenants with a government agency, assisted by NGOs providing extension support. If we plot this activity over 2 dimensions, where we define commitment, a landowner's commitment to its covenanting process, you can look at that in terms of retention over time. Does a landowner stay in the program forever? Because if you invest it for 5 years in a landowner and then he or she leaves, you've effectively lost that investment. And then looking at compliance with a management plan. So is that landowner fencing off priority plant locations, not ploughing down to the river edge, keeping down weeds, that sort of thing? We get landowners involved in that program. We can have 4 different types of outcomes that might relate to failure or not if we just simply divide that space into 4. So ideally we're looking for this fully committed space where landowner would be satisfied, they're learning all the time, and there's an opportunity to achieve conservation outcomes. The worst case scenario is when somebody leaves early and compliance has been poor. They might be in the program for a year, they plough down to the river, they cut down trees anyway. We've seen this in the winelands in the same area we did this study. 95% of grape growers producing wine around the Stellenbosch region who had signed covenants cleared on their property anyway. So it's not a good example, and in some cases these farmers actually budgeted for the fine that they were going to get because they're making so much money. The fine's 10,000 Rand, which is not a lot of money, and I've actually been told by a wine grower, yeah, it's a line item in our annual costings because they know that they're going to get done and they don't care because the fine's not substantial. So this is the worst case scenario. But failure can then also be where there is compliance but somebody leaves. And so you see this a lot when farmers join a covenant with a time frame. They want to pass their farm on to their kids, but they don't want to foreclose on the opportunity for their children to still farm. So we've got a good farmer, but he or she only is there for a short period of time. And then probably the worst is that somebody stays in a program forever, but they never comply. So you might have someone in a program for 30 years. This is particularly bad, obviously, if there's no evaluation and monitoring that's being done, because people are compromising biodiversity, but we're not even aware of it. So my point here is failure can take many forms. It's not always apparent, and we need to be able to diagnose failure, which means being able to define the right way, or the most appropriate way. So in terms of causes, a guy called Reason back in 2000 provided the definitive text on human failure and how it happens. One of the models that he produced is that failures are normally complicated. It's not normally one thing that happens. It's normally the perfect storm where there's an alignment of serious problems which collectively mean that there's some sort of loss. So if there wasn't a hole here, but it was up here instead, the failure trajectory wouldn't manifest, even though a couple of other things had gone wrong. There's a good example there with one of the space shuttles that blew up. I can't remember which one it was now, but there's a book that's been written about it. Sorry? There's been two different ones that exploded where the astronauts were all killed. And it's a great case study of there was a dozen different things that went wrong before it actually blew up. It wasn't actually a single action or event. So understanding all these factors is going to be really complicated. It's going to be really difficult to unpack. The second thing, this is Amy Edmondson's work, which is mainly from the business sector, is there's a whole bunch of reasons for why a project might fail, and most of these would apply to conservation. So the first is somebody harpoons a project deliberately, then makes sure that it fails, all the way through to somebody was actually formally testing an approach to see if failure would happen, whether or not it would work, and it failed. So it's an attempt to learn that didn't work. Other times, the process simply might have been adequate. So a competent individual adheres to a prescribed but faulty or incomplete process. So somebody does the right thing, but it doesn't work out. And this is one of the problems with best practice. So best practice is talked about all the time as something we should follow. I would disagree with that strongly because we're working in highly dynamic, highly complex systems. They change all the time. If we keep applying the same rules to how we're going to be effective, the rules are going to become increasingly mismatched against what's going to work and what's not going to work. So these are two good examples of models about how we think failure functions. One of the things that comes out consistently from other sectors is the biggest single defining factor of a team that learns from failure and is effective, not just at learning but in delivering outcomes, is an idea called psychological safety, which is effectively akin to trust. So in a study you may have heard about, Google did a 2-year study of all its high-performing teams. Didn't matter how much people were paid, the level of education, how old they were, their gender. The thing that came out that defined highly performing teams was whether or not people were prepared to sit down and say, this failed because of you, or it failed because of me, and trust one another enough to unpack that, talk about it. And that sort of suggests that it sounds kind of easy when you say it quickly, but it's really, really difficult. The high-performing teams also had the most mistakes, the most errors. And that's primarily because they talk about when things go wrong. And have you heard about fail fast, fail often? If you make something small goes wrong and you check, small goes wrong and you check, partly because Reason's model says little things go wrong and then we have a catastrophic failure. So if you're checking the little things and you're able to adapt, you're possibly less likely to fail. So you need to be able to speak up about problems and errors and do it honestly and frankly. There needs to be no fear of blame or shame. So you can't, whilst you need to talk about it, you can't shame somebody about it and say it's your fault. Commercial aviation is a good example here. If you make a mistake in the cockpit of a 747, you've got 10 days to report that mistake. And in that time, you can't be charged under law. After 10 days, they'll throw the book at you. So what it is, it's a reprieve to encourage people to do the right thing and to share those lessons. And this idea of constructive conflict needs to be promoted. So respectful dialogue where people are honest. It doesn't mean that it can't get heated in order to extract information. So a good example here is in the US military. Peter Catalano again talking about an incident that happened where two F-18s almost flew into one another, landing on an aircraft carrier at night, really dangerous situation. They get everybody together. This is a formal process. They go up to the bridge from the commander on the aircraft carrier to the person who pulls the chocks out from the wheel before the aircraft takes off. They get up in the room, the door's locked, rank dissolves. So it doesn't matter whether you're the lowest on the hierarchy or you're the guy who's driving the ship with 1,500 people on it. Everybody's opinion counts for the same thing. Everyone's expected to tell the truth, and when you walk into the room, you have to look everybody in the eye and shake their hand and say, it's good to see you. Even though the stories that we were getting back from the pilots were, I almost died because this idiot cut me off in midair or landed without putting his signalling lights on, whatever the issue was. And so my point here is that there are these procedures that people go through to promote psychological safety in these other sectors. People know what cognitive biases are. Basically a heuristic that your brain goes through to shortcut the amount of information that it's got to process to make a decision. Because there is so much that's actually coming in that you're not aware of, that your brain's actually dealing with, that we need these shortcuts to be able to make decisions. So they help us make decisions really quickly, and essentially they're rules of thumb that we use. So far there's at least 150 different types. Everybody has them, so you don't have all 150, which you're probably relieved to hear, but everybody has cognitive biases simply because it's the way your cognition works. It's how your brain functions. You can't avoid it. One of the fortunate things is that they result in predictable systematic errors in judgment. So we can predict them, we can identify them, which is a good thing, obviously, if we want to avoid them. They're very, very deeply embedded in our psyche, in our psychology, so we can't avoid them, which means that we have to learn how to manage them. And these are just a couple of types that we think affect, based on the literature reviews we've done, that affect conservation. So, for example, confirmation bias, seeking confirmation that what we already think or believe. So this, for example, would be manifest where ecologists only look at ecological reasons for why projects fail, and there may be elements to a failure that are ecological. The nest box was the wrong size, but it could have also been that they were put in the wrong place by someone who didn't actually read the instructions on what the layout was and where they should be put. Okay, so people start examining what they already think would be the primary cause of a failure. Another example there was we reviewed the motivations of landholders that join covenanting programs. Men overwhelmingly look for economic reasons for why people join. Women are much better researchers in this regard, and then they tend to ask people, why did you join? Why are you satisfied? Whereas men tend to have gone in and said, well, it's obviously financial incentives which are going to affect you, so how much money would you like, or when would you like it, how many payments, those sorts of things. So there's a good example of people confirming what they already believe. So there's a whole bunch of them, and they affect us in different ways to different degrees, and academics are particularly prone to certain types. The other thing is that we need, if we're going to learn effectively from our phase in conservation, we need robust long-term institutional systems. So I talked about the example of the US naval aviation on aircraft carriers. We've got to have systems in our conservation program. So WWF, for example, needs to have systems in place, and I don't single them out for any particular reason, just as an example that you all know, where you identify, document, discuss and distribute the lessons from those failures, because otherwise it just doesn't happen. We're really clear about that. So having protocols and systems is really important. And we need data. And I probably don't have to convince anybody in this room the importance of data when you're making decisions, but it's absolutely critical. So one of the things that you find when you look at naval aviation, for example, they have this 20-80 rule. You talk about what went well 20% of the time and what went wrong 80% of the time. And you roughly measure that whilst you're in the room so that you focus upon the elements of an experience that are going to help you learn most. And this is basically the example I talked about from the military. And then you need to be documenting those. They need to be catalogued somewhere. So the peer-reviewed literature would be one place that might be able to do that. So if we were going to move forward in conservation and look at how we might learn from failure more effectively, this is the end of the talk now effectively, we should be aiming for what in the business world they call a failure orientation. people are orientated towards failure in a positive way. So they see failure as an opportunity to learn rather than something to be scolded over. There are essentially two dimensions. The first is a human dimension, so the psychology of individuals and teams and how people interact with one another within an organisational structure. Across individuals, so we look at psychology, and groups, where we're looking at sociology and team function. The second is in an operational dimension, which is why we talk about the need for systems and protocols, where we have systems which are effectively the hardware for learning from failure, and then mindsets, so the way that we view failure. And there are basically 4 quadrants to that that all fit together into an effective learning from failure process in conservation. And I should say too, we haven't tested this. This is a theory that I'm going to try and commit DBCA to start testing. Whether or not that happens is a whole other thing. So looking at, political systems are adverse to failure. You'll attest to that, Saul, won't you? Yeah. So things individually that are about a mindset, so things like mental models, acknowledging that everybody's reality is different, acknowledging that cognitive biases are a real entity that we need to get over. In terms of groups, a learning culture, working on things like psychological safety within groups. And this is something which is generally really poor in conservation from our reviews. In terms of systems, we need things like in the commercial aviation sector, like incentives and accountability. So if you report a failure in your translocation program within 10 days, we're not going to ham you about that. And group learning tools like debriefs, formal structures that people go through to make sure that they systematically gather data on failures. And then finally, things such as surfacing errors and seeking and sharing feedback, data gathering. So do we have protocols in place for actually collecting information systematically? So this is the next phase of research. It's essentially comparing this to a bunch of data that Alison's actually analysing at the moment from interviews and focus groups, and then seeing if we can get DBCA to implement this with some of their teams to trial it and see how it works. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take questions if anyone.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
Knowing you failed assumes that you knew what you were doing in the first place. Is that a safe assumption?
No, a lot of.
Conservation route?
I'd argue that we don't. So if you look at the roots of conservation biology in its sort of formal academic sense, they were geneticists and population ecologists, and most of what they wrote was about on those topics. But when you look at the data that you find from the literature, which is only the peer-reviewed literature, I should have made that point, it's human factors, social factors, which are the problem. So this is why I talked about an ability to conceptualise a system effectively. And that's another thing is in conservation, one of the things that we've found from our interviews and discussions with people, the actual research we've done, people don't take the time to understand a system. So we've talked to policy scientists, for example, who'll spend 2 years. Susan Clark with the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem in the US is a great example. She spent 2 years talking to people, trying to understand what was going on in that system before they actually started to design an approach to intervene. But we've spoken to quite a few conservation professionals who were like, we heard this money was coming up. It was 2 years worth of money. We had a month to prepare the report, the application. We wrote the application, we got it in. We got funded, and that's problematic for multiple reasons. Invariably, the grant was designed probably poorly because the system wasn't understood properly. Secondly, we also found that people often apply for money for reasons that have nothing to do with conservation. They've got a bunch of team members who are on a short-term contract, they have families, they need a job, put the application in, get some money because we've simply got to keep people on. So that's a long-winded way of saying...
So they succeeded in fact. It wasn't a failure because they actually employed the people. So from their perspective, their goals are achieved. I found it interesting the diversity of answers to your initial question because that showed that, in fact, this group would have had different definitions of failure right from the outset.
Absolutely.
The rejectors right at the beginning were completely different.
And they will have missed things too. So one of the things that becomes really clear is your concept of the world greatly affects your ability to identify and define what failure is. And so that's one of the reasons why we've been engaging with systems thinking over the last couple of years in an attempt to, because they have a whole suite of tools. this is the thing, once you start looking at policy sciences, systems thinking, evaluation, and I don't mean impact evaluation of protected areas because that's actually pretty crappy when it comes to systems approach to understanding conservation. These other disciplines have been developing these tools. In some cases, for the policy sciences, it goes back 90 years. They've been developing ways of trying to understand systems. So I would argue that that's something that we need to do much better at and take the time to do. And I appreciate that donors often don't give you that time to do that, but we need to figure out how to start integrating that into our approaches. But you're right, definitions are highly variable, and everyone in this room may define a failure or a success for the same project differently.
Following on this, it seems to me that in most cases there are multiple objectives. Some are clear, like worded, others are implicit. Right? For example, keep people on the job. So I'm just wondering, it might be helpful to define a failure or success relative to a particular objective. Any project usually will have multiple objectives. Some of them can be hidden. And so a project could be a failure relative to one objective, but a success. So for example, that example you gave maybe failed in terms of conservation, but succeeded in terms of keeping the people on, employed. So I'm just thinking it's more like a little matrix there, a little table where we have different actions, and then some of them would have allowed the success in this dimension, but actually generated a failure in the other dimension. And that probably then, when we discuss this afterwards, is reassessing what are our priorities, and in fact, making explicit things that are not. And that can be a problem because in some cases, particularly up in government, they don't want things to be clear. They don't want things to be explicit.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and that comes back to Amy Edmondson's definitions of failure in part. So I think what you're saying highlights the fact that we're working in these really complex contexts. There is no one definition of failure that's going to be pragmatic most of the time. And I think historically in conservation that's borne out because you'd get, project goals which were, double the population size of, breeding pairs of bilbies in the Pilbara, for example. Well, it could be that the big problem is actually the pastoralists and the way they're grazing. And you may actually want to, one of your objectives, like what you're saying, I think, might actually be to reduce grazing pressure exercised by pastoralists over the Pilbara by 45%, as well as these other aspects. And then rapid learning through examining failures quickly. So if you look at conservation projects, they tend to be evaluated on a yearly or an end of project cycle. If you look at, I've had discussions with people in the development sector where they're evaluating on a weekly basis. They hold a workshop, they evaluate the workshop instead of just doing the workshop, I think we've achieved what we wanted to achieve. And then 12 months down the track, doing an evaluation of the whole project. That other sectors don't do it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, just a comment on the aviation sector, because that's a sector I know well, where they report every little failure, not just the big crashes, but I left a ladder leaning against the wing, is reported because there's no consequence, allegedly. But then a newsletter comes out every month or so where all these reports are anonymized and shown to the whole industry. So I'm wondering if, with all the work you've done, you have taken this further either to the conservation sector in Australia or even globally. Is there some sort of organization where just even small reports could be collated and shared to help that learning that you have to get?
Yeah, so we've had discussions with Mark Schwartz from Conservation Science in Practice, and with Adina Merrilander, who's the head of the Society of Conservation Biology, and Alison, looking at developing a template or a format for a section for that journal. So those discussions are ongoing. Mark's very open to it.
Applied ecologists could be where they would blog.
Every journal should probably have one. So Richard was pretty visionary in terms of getting that set up, because I was editor-in-chief of Conservation Letters, and I tried for 2 years to get that set up there, and Wiley weren't interested. And I prompted Gary Murphy when he was in charge of conservation biology, and he wrote a stern little note in one of the issues about how he wasn't going to put up with this.
But it could even be worth a journal. Geez, there must be so much information out there.
Yeah, there's been talk, and I don't know, Richard, if you want to comment on that from your experience, or?
I mean, the big problem is that there's multiple barriers in the way to get this going. First of all, people have the stigma about reporting their failure, but then there's the hurdles you have to jump over to actually get it published and so on. Because there's usually space constraints in journals, people only want to get good stories, you don't want to get bad stories. And so, you know, even if the editor is supportive, send out a bunch of referees and say, well, that's crap, why are we publishing this? So, you know, so there's still lots of institutional barriers in the way of actually making it work, although, you know, lots of people recognize it's important. So our journal section has been very successful, but I think there's still a big stigma more generally about publishing negative results. And, you know, it's difficult as a journal editor, if you get something reporting a failure, it could just be that the study is crap in the first place. So, you know, you need to filter out what's a true failure and what's just badly done study.
Well, but that could be part of it. That could be a failure, right? I've failed to design this study properly.
This,
I don't know. I think that's
who's designed a bad study in the past?
yeah, definitely.
But my early work in psychology, because I'm a soil scientist by training, was diabolical, and my partner's a neuropsychologist who, when we got together, proceeded to show me where I should have done things differently. Who's next? Yeah.
I am a social scientist, and so it was really great to see the shift in the linear to the non-linear. And I'm just wondering, one of the reasons that it's difficult to get published is because everybody wants to have really nice secret lines and everything. But if we're thinking about learning, then learning beyond beyond publications, I think is a really important part of how we engage and communicate our impact, because we don't want the conservationists just to be talking to conservationists. I'm really fortunate that I ended up on mailing list where I get these to be able to come to you, otherwise I might not hear about it. So it's the ways in which we communicate. And I wondered if in the spirit of the learning aspect you might like to comment on that further.
Yeah, there's some really simple tools. So one is debriefing. So you get together as a team and just work through a simple template. So the one that I use is a 7-question table that's taken from the military literature that was tweaked for the medical sector. And the benefit there is you can think about those things, but there's a structure that you step through, and they're in a particular order for a particular reason, and they've been developed through trial and error from practice. And it makes you pretty uncomfortable, and you've got to do it with people that you can trust in your team. There are informal things like water cooler conversations, they call them, you know, like being prepared just to have a chat with somebody informally about those things as opposed to a formal structure. You've got to have a database. You've got to be gathering data on all these things. Every time you run a workshop, you've got to be filling out your template and sticking it in to a database. That's one of the benefits of the aviation sector, is that they have trillions of records and they can mine it for tiny little patterns, and they can see that a particular plane has a particular arrangement of buttons where, you know, 0.001% of the time the wrong button gets pushed, but that's enough to send the plane spiralling down towards the ground. So database systems are really important, and then a process for mainstreaming. Like, you've got to do it day to day. It's got to be something that you work into the way that you do every day. And I'm not claiming to have achieved that, absolutely. Part of the reason for researching is to try and figure it out.
I think we need to talk back to him.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
We can chat afterwards if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So let me thank Dr. Andrew for a very interesting presentation.